I'm Jill Leovy, a reporter with the Los Angeles Times and author of the nonfiction book Ghettoside. I'm here with Yale law professor James Forman Jr., also a defense attorney and a youth education advocate. And we're here to talk about criminal justice issues and some of the ideas that I propound in Ghettoside. Thanks for being here, James.
Oh yeah, no, I'm thrilled to do it. I'm thrilled to do it. I found the book Ghettoside so compelling and so captivating, and in a lot of ways so challenging. I mean, it's a book full of characters, but it's also a book that has an argument. And so, as a law professor, I was really interested in getting a chance to talk to you about kind of the arguments of the book and exploring those. So, I mean, as I kind of take your main claim. It's that we treat Black lives as cheap, and in particular, one of the ways that we do that is that we fail to investigate, arrest, prosecute, and convict people who commit violent crimes against African Americans, particularly homicide and also other shootings. And I guess when I first picked up the book and I started reading it and I started to take in that claim, I have to say I was taken aback because I'm somebody who's been studying the criminal justice system for the last 40 years. I've watched as we become the world's largest jailer. I've watched as we've thrown money at the problem to the tune of a 400% increase in expenditures on criminal justice matters over the last 40 years.
Right.
And so the idea that there was a corner of the system, that there was some part of our law enforcement apparatus that was under-resourced, that hadn't gotten enough money, as you describe the homicide division, was startling to me. And so I guess I'm curious to know how is it possible that that's true? And obviously you think so because you argue that it is, but how did it come to be?
Yeah, and there's two things that I would separate here. One is sort of the harsh and punitive character of the system, and the other specifically the issue of resources. The second one is not at all mysterious. We're talking about great, big, giant, self-contradictory public bureaucracies, and just like you can mount an enormous war effort to invade another country and invent the world's most terrifying drones, you can still not have enough body armor for your soldiers. There can still be a great unevenness in the way things are funded and where your priorities play out, even inside a behemoth of public bureaucracy. You see that in law enforcement, I think, all the time and all through history. I would disagree with you that it's a well-funded system across the board. There's definitely, and certainly if you look back, particularly at criminal courts through the 60s and 70s, there was sort of this bonfire of the vanities era where it's a very shabby system, really, a shabby and overtaxed system. You see things. We did a study here of homicide in the early 90s, so the big era when so many people were dying of cases in Los Angeles County, and many startling findings from that. But one of their findings was that it was so threadbare, it was so slapdash, the way cases were being rushed through the courts, that they had actually charged a few people for homicide for killing victims who were still alive and were not actually dead. And nobody had attended to matters enough to realize that it was not a homicide case. This is not a fully functioning, well-funded system. At the same time, you see, I think huge waste in criminal justice and policing in particular. We had a reporter here, not myself, who did a wonderful story about counterterrorism, and specifically, I think it's called the Bearcat, which is a tank-like toy. It's this huge car for SWAT operations, and she found that the smallest and safest locales in California, these itty-bitty police departments in resort towns with no crime, would have a Bearcat just in case they needed it for some kind of SWAT operation or counterterrorism or something. So you see great unevenness, those reflect ideas, lineages of ideas going way back, and the character of the system, which is the second part I wanted to address. You know, Eric Monkkonen, who I use so much, has a riff about harshness and weakness, and he talks about the weak king has to lop off people's heads. The strong king can be lenient because he has full control of his kingdom. I think there's a little bit of that aspect to American criminal justice in general. It's not a coincidence that we have very high homicide rates for the Western world, for a developed country, and also this very harsh system. Those things actually go together. It's less contradictory to me as I get in the weeds than it seems initially. We have, and I would say across the political spectrum, not engaged with this idea that investigations are preventive, in the sense that they materially build sort of a legalistic setting for people. It's not something that we talk about. The ideas that I put forward in the book about kind of this being related to failed states, it's something that international scholars talk about and historians always talk about. Whenever they're talking about legal development, they're talking about the state's monopoly on violence and how it's built. But in criminology, in sociology, in legal scholarship, often I think this is actually not the terms that we've used to talk about this issue. So yes, it does seem contradictory, but certainly when you see it close up, it's actually astonishing. You know, the secretary who I quote in the homicide division that I was in South Bureau, she's told to ration the supply closet. We know here at the LA Times that the health of your supply closet in an organization tells you the value of the function. They still write a lot of things down. It's actually the best technology is to just write when you're doing investigations. And pens were at a premium, and notebooks, as I said on the Daily Show, I had to really watch my notebooks and pens because they would get swiped when I was there. And the secretary said to me, you know, I'm going against the order to ration. And I said, why? And she kind of threw up her arms and she said, they're homicide detectives. Why wouldn't I just give them the notebooks? Even to her, it was astonishing that they were in this situation. But it wasn't what was being talked about. It wasn't what the public was talking about. It wasn't what reformers have been talking about. And in a way, police departments are very responsive, particularly under Bratton, who sort of perfected the police department response to public concerns, that they were so busy responding to other things that since nobody was saying solve the homicides, they maybe appropriately, because they are being responsive to public demands, didn't make that a high priority.
So let me ask you about that when you say nobody was saying, you know, solve the homicides, because it seems like it is connected to the point you're making about how police departments choose to use the resources that they have. So when police leaders talk about some of their investment in prevention and investment in patrol and some of the things that you identify as having gotten a lot of resources, because your point, the counter to your point about the no supply closet is you also talk about parts of the LAPD having lavish resources and new cars and low caseloads. And so it isn't just a question of, well, we just should give more money to this system, right? You're making an argument about how the system is deploying the resources that it has. Right. And when you talk to police leaders and you ask them about, including Bratton, including police leaders in New York, basically police leaders everywhere, they talk about their patrol decisions and they talk about things like stop and frisk, right, that whatever it is that they're doing on the front end, they talk about as protecting Black lives and protecting brown lives in communities where you have a substantial African American Latino population. I mean, you hear this over and over again.
They do now,
and
Bratton especially, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you really have, and so I guess so I guess I'm a little confused then about the sort of explanation for how this would come to be, because you say, well, nobody's demanding it.
Right.
But Black communities, as you point out in the book, are demanding it, have been demanding it, go to police meetings, go to precinct meetings, are involved in community organizations, and are saying, have been saying Black Lives Matter since we've had Black Lives to Matter. So this isn't a new claim.
That's right.
And so I guess I'm then confused as to why you think we've had this misallocation of resources or what we've chosen or focus, given that they're doing one thing, justifying it on the grounds that Black Lives Matter, and the other thing would also be justified on the same grounds.
Right, right. Well, and there's something, it's not a rigorously, the hypotheses in policing are generally not rigorously tested, and there's a tendency, especially when you have a decade-long crime decline, to say that everything you're doing works. And so it's hard to sift things out. It's one of the reasons that I really wanted to get to causes with the Black homicide rate. It's one of the reasons that I really wanted that history was such a strong clue as to what was going on. I think you have to start with, you have to start by being mystified by it. And we haven't been mystified enough about it. There's sort of been a lot of sort of easy dismissal, poverty causes that. Well, there's lots of evidence that suggests poverty actually doesn't cause it necessarily, or the causal lines are fairly tangled. Or other sort of ideas, again, generally accepted by both right and left, that actually, when you really examine them, don't seem to hold together. So, yes, first of all, it's not even activism, it's not even community meetings. Just about on every traffic stop in South LA, somebody hollers this at the cops. Why don't you guys do some real work? Why are you harassing me? It's nothing novel. There's a very strong sense about what matters and what doesn't. But this is hard, it's complex. I don't think that there's been a consensus of what the problem is and how to fix it. So you often hear, even among the people who are most knowledgeable, and that means residents who live in these streets, who worry about their sons all the time, who have lived this in their own lives and their grandparents' lives, they often will express bafflement and mystification and say what is really going on. And honestly, especially in very poor neighborhoods, the lines that people spout are not that different than you would find across America in very different partisan settings. If I had $1 for everyone who's come up to me and said, it's because they don't have good fathers, who's Black and poor and living in these neighborhoods. I mean, everybody has the same idea. This is not another America. We are all Americans and think about these things in the same way. So it's hard, it's mysterious. People just say, do something, do something. And actually, police executives, people like Bratton, when he first came to LA, everyone said he was going to run for public office and had these political aspirations. It's very clear now that he wants to be a police chief, and that's what he's doing. He's, I assume, dedicated to that idea, and I certainly know a lot of people in policing who are like, well, we want to do something. These are the tools we have, so let's do this. I just think it does need to be taken apart a little, and what I'm trying to say in Ghettoside is that it's not all the same. And it's not even points on a spectrum. Violence is really, really different. Violence creates a very, very special context around itself. bodily violence, the hurting of an individual's body, the killing of a human being is not just a more serious property crime. And it's a real kvetch I have with a lot of criminologies to call violent crime all of these variety of robberies and also murder. We'll throw that in there. Murder is really different. I'm sure working in DC and working among youth, you've seen this. It might not make the news, but it is a nuclear bomb for the people around it who experience the horror of someone being murdered in their midst. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that there's something foundational in the way we relate to one another about violence and how violence is handled in a society. And so, the law is for this, and it's for a lot of other things. And when it functions, it can cover a lot of bases. But wherever you've got a situation where little stuff is being hammered and this elephant in the room, violence is not being sort of properly measured and responded to, it's corrosive. It turns everything upside down. It is a recipe for illegitimacy. It's a recipe for mistrust. It is what changes a system from being a system of adequate protection and control to just being control and oppression. And I think it's different. If you've really given people physical protection, if you've really dealt with violence, and then maybe you start to get that pile the quality of life stuff on top of that, it's different. I still would question how much of that other stuff you need. But if you haven't first attended to the violence, the keystone is missing. You're not actually building law. And, what I'd love, and you're actually who I wrote the book for, and I've gotten very little response from scholars. I would love people to talk about this because I have these embryonic notions of it, but there's a lot in anthropology that suggests this. Hunter-gatherers tend to have high homicide rates, and it changes as people grow more organized and tribal. But it depends on the society. They're highly different. And I saw one study that said, you can have the elders under a tree. You can have lots of different forms of government. You can have chieftains. And the only way those systems work to bring down rates of homicide is if they are endowed with the power to punish violence. That is the thing that makes it different. And I think that's just a very small sort of vague hint at something that I would like to see people dig further into. It's certainly conspicuous in Black history, this problem, right?
Yes, although it's interesting. I'm not as convinced that your book points to an answer necessarily for how to reduce violence in America or in Black communities. I mean, I believe in the claim that you're making about focusing on investigation and focusing on what you call the aftermath and having the state take seriously Black suffering, in particular suffering, violent crime and homicide. I'm totally sold on that the system doesn't do a good job of that you're right about that, and that communities deserve that. But I'm not convinced of it as a way of further reducing violence. I mean, I think it probably will. It has to be the case that if you arrest somebody who has, just given what we know about recidivism, arresting more people who have committed acts of violence is going to have an effect on the crime rate. That's certainly true, it seems to me. But I guess I'm not as convinced by in part because, as you say, we haven't done a very good job of this thing you're describing, and yet crime has gone down significantly over the past 15 or 20 years. So, and this is, as you know, this is the thing that vexes criminologists, because anything any of us would want to point to hasn't changed that much in the last 20 years, and yet crime has gone down so much, including violent crime. Although, as you know, as you write, it's still too high. So I guess I just want to say I don't think your claim to me stands on its own terms, whether or not a better homicide division would further reduce homicide levels in LA, because people deserve the state to respond to their suffering.
It's interesting because I'm pleased with this. I get it from the right and from the left. I get these emails that I'm making excuses for violent criminals, and then I'm also an apologist for the jackbooted, oppressive criminal justice system. I think that contained in this argument is actually an argument for limits on government power, and for a discussion of, and for some reverence about the terrifying power of the state arrayed against the individual, right? How do we appropriately deploy such terrifying power? Well, start with this. It's actually justified in the case of murder. It's justified with these very, very serious assaults. Start with what is really legitimate use of that power, and then think long and hard about deploying that terribly destructive power against, for example, municipal code violations in Ferguson. So it is an argument for limits. But just to push back at you a little, I would say then, if it's not the failure to build law in black communities, and by the way, it's very important to say abetted by especially residential segregation. That's a huge piece in the puzzle here. But if it's not this, then what? Because what I don't accept, both on logical grounds and on the grounds of my own observations over years and years, is that there's something wrong with these people, that they are unable to adapt culturally or socially in some way that creates these pathologies in their communities. And it's not, part of it is just seeing so many, and I'm sure you have too, as I say in the book, normal guys. People who, as John Skaggs said, if they'd grown up a few blocks away, if they weren't under these kinds of pressures, if they didn't have this serpent's maw at their feet growing up, and especially when they hit 13 and 14 and 15, that drags them into this underworld of violence and of vengeance and of losing their friends and being an adolescent and coping with those emotions and figuring out what to do with them, that it's not because of what they think or how they're raised or how their families have loved each other. It's this thing that's so conspicuous when you're on the ground that's ensnaring them.
Right. So, okay. So let me ask you about that, because this gets to one of the things I struggled with in the book, which is your hero, John Skaggs. So, he's your hero, and you build kind of an argument around him. He's a homicide detective. He's extraordinarily good at his job. And you say his life is devoted to making black life expensive. And I struggled with this portrayal, in part because he, like most of the officers you write about, you say are Republicans. And you don't dwell on that fact in the book, but I actually think it matters, and I think it matters to the argument of the book, because what we know is there are lots of ways in which you could make black life more expensive, right? We could make our neighborhoods less segregated. You just mentioned. We could reduce poverty. We could put more money in the hands of poor people. We could provide health care to people who are leaving prison, like Obamacare is trying to do. We could raise the minimum wage.
Disparities.
What's that?
Attack the wealth disparities, right?
Yeah, right. But so here's the thing. By and large, the Republican Party, and not just them, but they've led the way on this, has fought tooth and nail against all these other ways of making black life matter, making black life costly. And the one that they've supported is investment in our criminal justice system. And so for me, somebody who is choosing that and only that and fighting every other way That to me is exactly what's wrong with the past 40 years, which is that out of all the myriad ways that we could help Black communities to thrive, we've given African Americans only criminal justice, only police, only prosecutors, only prisons. And so it's kind of hard for me to root for a character who embodies that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of things to say to that, most of which are not very interesting. One is that, to me, Yadira Tonelli and Barbara Pritchett are the heroes of the book. Skaggs is a necessary protagonist, also a bit of a comic figure. I don't know if anyone catches that, but he would not mind my saying so. The partisan stuff, you know, as a reporter, you want to stay out ahead of it. You want to keep them. You want to keep a step ahead of all of it. If you're working in an area where everyone's already thought out their thoughts and fitted them into some agenda, then you're too far behind the curve. You got to be out there. So, you know, I try to listen really hard to people from all sides. Most of the cops I know are Republicans. By the way, their parents were, and their parents' were. It's something they grew up with. It's part of where they're from. Skaggs, in particular, is one of the least reflective and least analytical people I've ever met in my life. And I don't think, thinks politically very often. It's sort of a default status for him. Having said that, I wanted to go to the important and interesting stuff here, which is stunts. It's not just a story of accreting harshness beginning in the 80s. It's a story of a ricochet. And both the right and the left take some hits here. This idea that he has, and Mark Kleiman has, about the era of leniency in the 60s and 70s, the idea that units of punishment per crime were lower. It's very interesting that that coincides, at least in LA, with tens of thousands of impoverished Black migrants from the South flowing into industrial cities and being crowded into these segregated enclaves. Very interesting that we would choose not to invest in our courts in good prosecutions in that exact era when violent crime is exploding among that poor and suffering population. It works both ways. I think that we were too weak in one era, and instead of finding a middle, we went over to whatever it is, 5 times the rate of imprisonment per population now in California than 40 years ago. And both sides, as is always the sad story, disadvantage Blacks to a terrible degree. In the one case, because, in Los Angeles, some of the highest Black male homicide rates we've seen in the history of the city were in the 70s before anybody was talking about it. You really do get a sense then that, that was the era when people said NHI, no humans involved, when prosecutors said population control and shrugged their shoulders down at the courthouse, when people got out of prison for 6-7 years for homicide because they were killing other Black people and it wasn't in the papers. That too really keeps people down. That's a terrible thing to do to people. Just like excessive harshness is a terrible thing to do to people. We have to open our minds to look at this in more complex ways. And by the way, very, very nice trick in the South, right? It's an amazing thing not to give people adequate law enforcement and then sit back and say, well, look at them. They're infantile. They kill each other. Too bad we can't help them, right?
No, I totally agree. And as you know, these are, issues that I've been writing about and that are important to me. So I'm totally with you on the point about the ricochet effect and the idea that not providing enough law enforcement is I don't know if you say equally bad or worse, but another harm just like what we do now. I think you're totally right about that. Let me ask you, but I guess what I want to say is if you're making an argument about the criminal justice system, and this is I'm going to turn, I guess, to another question here. I don't think you can look at the criminal justice system piece by piece. We sort of have to look at it as a whole. And so one of the things that I struggled with in the book, and I just want to hear your reaction to, and I should say for anybody who's listening, or watching this part, there's a bit of a spoiler alert here. So if you're going to buy the book and you don't want to know kind of what happens at the end, you might want to press pause here. But this, I mean, it's there's a crime here that is investigated and is ultimately solved. And one of the people who is arrested is a juvenile, kid named Devin Davis. And, you say Skaggs is not the hero. I have to say, I feel like the way the book is written, maybe there's multiple heroes, I'll accept that. He's certainly a heroic figure. There may be others, and even with his comic elements, we're rooting for Skaggs. And at this moment, we're supposed to be rooting for him to get this juvenile into the interrogation room and break him down and get a confession. And we learn that the kid, he's a kid, he's a teenager, he's 16 or 17. He has ADHD. Skaggs says that he looks a little bit off, like maybe he's immature or has some sort of disability.
That's right.
But he gets him in the room without a lawyer, and he's an excellent homicide detective, and he's got a teenager who has no lawyer, and he gets a confession. And this is a victory. And then he goes to trial, and he ends up getting a sentence of life without parole.
Right.
And I guess for me, as somebody who wants to say, listen, I want to have a criminal justice conversation in which I simultaneously can embrace a reform agenda that says Black Lives Matter and simultaneously confronts a homicide epidemic and confronts a criminal justice system that's often overly punitive. And I want that. I want to be able to have both of those things. I reject the idea that one has to come at the expense of another.
Yeah.
For example, I reject the idea that arrests have to come with interrogations of kids with mental disabilities without lawyers. And I reject the idea that convictions have to come with sentences of life without parole for kids that have committed crimes when they're juveniles. I mean, Brian Stevenson would tell us, and I agree, that that's a system that lacks mercy, that lacks compassion. And so I guess one of the things I struggled with in the book is you present these as trade-offs, and this book is then about us rooting for the system to hold these people accountable. And I want to create space for a form of accountability that doesn't look so, that doesn't mean death in prison for a teenager.
Right. Well, I am pretty agnostic about punishment, and actually you'd be surprised how many of the cops I know are too. And not entirely. I want to get to that in a second. Part of the point is catch them. Catch them and prosecute them swiftly. That if we didn't have 40% clearance rate for homicide for Black men in urban areas, and if we had 80%, that you would, I think, achieve a lot of the intended deterrence goals of punishment without those sentences. And of course, you see in countries that have achieved this, that have a fully realized state monopoly on violence and extremely low homicide rates, which is what you see across Europe, they've also managed to ease off on the punishment side. It's interesting that these things go together. And certainly right now, you're seeing this with the Supreme Court. Juvenile life sentences without parole are being revisited and being reconsidered. Too late for many people, obviously, but that one's been won, and I suspect will be expanded. I think it's pending, and so that actually was something I was hoping that people would look at in the book. And because whenever we talk, even just when people talk about deterrence, they're always talking about these prison sentences and not looking at how few people are caught. And I believe, I'm not an expert on this, but economists have looked at this, criminologists. It's actually the catching. It's the certainty of being caught that does operate as a deterrence. I'm not a huge fan of those kinds of studies and the way they're done. I think they can conceal a lot, but there is some evidence there. And I also think there's something deeper about the way law works. One of the best things I've read this year is by your colleague James Forman, where he talks about European systems and the separation of mercy and punishment versus truth in conviction that those systems incorporate. The idea is finding a community standard about what happened here, the conversation that is a trial, determining the truth of what happened to this person who's been murdered. And what do we do with the guilty are separate questions, and that we don't think about it enough. And in fact, I think a lot of particularly liberal efforts in this arena make the mistake of not dealing with guilt. There are a lot of guilty people who are processed through our criminal justice system. And the great question is, how do we deal with the guilty? Too often, and I think too often in the public's mind, is, well, they can't possibly be guilty. They must be innocent. They must be innocents who are wrongly convicted by the system. Sometimes, sure, but I suspect a much bigger problem is guilty people and how do we deal with them. There's a defense attorney that wrote a great book called The Guilt Project. If you haven't seen it, Vanessa Place. She represents sex offenders. A stunning book, and one of the things she does, which I find so impressive and I wish more people would do, is she says, I'm not going to spare you anything. I'm going to walk you through the horror of these sex crimes that were committed by my clients. And they are horrific. It is a very, very tough read, because she says, unless you've seen the whole of it, then I can't really have an honest discussion about, the multiple life sentences that my client got for these crimes and where they really fit into our idea of constitutional justice. I don't think you have to shrink from the enormity of victimization in order to discuss these issues intelligently and actually come to a more merciful conclusion. That's something that the idea that you have to lead over victimization, it works in court if you're a defense attorney, but when we talk about this from a policy point of view, I think you should look the enormity of the crime in the face, particularly murder. And before I interviewed hundreds of parents who had lost their children to homicide, I have to admit it probably would have been easier for me to say the punishments should be lighter. I do think they should be lighter. It's a matter of how light. There is something in the societal recognition that something huge has happened here that is very, very important to people. And when, as is often the case in South Central LA, people say, I'm black, I'm poor, my son was nothing to anybody. They said he was just a gang member, he wasn't even on the news. It is sort of it is a cosmic message to them that they are valueless and somehow not fully realized constitutionally protected individuals in the society. It does matter. It's very interesting. I think one of the things I would love to see people talk about is informal justice systems and how they work, because I think we can learn a lot. In paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, for example, exile and banishment is a very frequent punishment that these gangs use, and I never see that in LA. It's always homicide or assault as the discipline or the punishment for snitching or whatever. In other ways, the kind of snitching cases are very similar, but they banish, they don't kill, and our gangs kill. And the use of banishment and exile in undeveloped legal systems all through history is very interesting. People seem to need somebody to be taken out of the community, to be taken out of the situation. I'm not sure that it's completely a completely wrong thing that's developed in our system. I think long ago I would have thought it was just an expensive, terrible thing that we have to put people in prison, but we have a society now where everything's connected. They would come back, so maybe there's more to it. I think in short that what I'm saying in Ghettoside, quite the opposite of being an endorsement of life sentences for juveniles, actually can be read as a way out. You can get deterrence, you can get truth, you can get justice, and then you can weigh this question of mercy and punishment in a different way.